All right. Well, good morning, and I hope you are having a good start to your day here. Looks like it's going to be a nice day outside, but we know in Minnesota in winter it will change, and as the forecast tells us or shows us, it definitely will change. And it's a Minnesotan thing to do is to talk about the weather, especially in the wintertime. All right. Does anyone have anything good to share for the cause before we start the day? Observations or just some aha moments? Okay. Well, as you can see on our agenda, we really are focusing on the First World War, and I do want to briefly talk a little bit about the total aspect of the First World War, and then give you some time to work on the summative assessment that is due for tomorrow. And so I have a video clip that I want to show, just a little clip of it, what is called shell shock. So it's going to highlight some of the new technology and the destructive nature of the First World War. And then also, since it is Black History Month, showcase a little bit about what is a group known as the Home Guard. And this is a group that replaced the National Guard, because many of the Guard units will be called up in the First World War. And this spotlight's going to be on African American Home Guard. And then give some time to work on that assignment. So that's our agenda. So let me get this video clip fired up here. And when I watch this video clip, I think of the movie that came out a few years ago, and it was called 1917. And one thing that stood out about that particular movie was the imagery that was focused on in that movie, and so the cinematography was incredible, and I think it captured the destructive nature of the First World War, as well as some of the obviously the highlighting some of the technology as well. All right, so we watch this video clip, viewer discretion as well, because it is about war, and there is a destructive nature of it and some graphicness with it. But I want you to think about some takeaways, how the war is being fought, and maybe some of the technology, and then we can discuss afterwards, because these clips always have a lot of good historical nuggets to it. All right.
By Christmas 1914, the armies of Europe had completely bogged down, and fighting had spread to Russia, Africa, and the Middle East. The empires drew on their colonies for manpower. 60 countries were eventually represented in the conflict. The Germans had expected to win in 42 days, but they had not anticipated what would happen on the Western Front in France. On the Western Front, the German assault had finally failed, and soldiers on both sides had raced to dig an elaborate trench system that stretched for 300 miles from the English Channel all the way to Switzerland. On New Year's Day in 1915, the young men who had gone off to fight glorious battles were now trapped in a desperate war of attrition.
Someone said to us excitedly, "Jack Smith." I said, "What about him?" "He's dead, he's been shot. The first one of the battalion to be shot." I said, "What?" "Yes, he's dead, he's been shot. He put his head too far over and a sniper got him." And that caused a bit of a sensation amongst the lads. They thought, well, this is not exactly what we come for kind of business. But later on, from that day onwards, when we went to the trenches, it was 3 killed, 4 killed, 5 killed, 20 killed, 100 killed. By then, we was veterans.
A young American poet, Alan Seeger, was among those looking for adventure when he joined the Foreign Legion to fight for France. His diary reveals how seldom he found it.
It's a miserable life, shivering in these wretched holes in the dirt. We're not leading the life of men at all, but that of animals, living in our holes in the ground, and only showing our heads outside to fight and to feed.
When we'd been there about 6 months, covered in mud, wet through practically all day, absolutely chewed up my lice. We used to say, and to think we wanted to come to this hole. I said, yes, we didn't know.
Every so often, one side or the other seized a few hundred yards of territory only to be forced back again, surrendering what had cost hundreds of lives to win. The front never moved more than a mile or two in either direction. By the spring of 1915, the generals had concluded that the best way out of the stalemate was to blast the enemy out of their trenches. The same factories and assembly lines that had begun to contribute to life in the 20th century were now retooled to create massive killing machines. This was the industrialization of war.
It was just the splintered trunks of trees, and there was the quagmire of the shell holes, and no grass. It was just like a lunar landscape, really.
At night, the rats, they grew to enormous sizes, feeding on the corpses there. It was impossible to get the dead buried.
We put dead bodies in the bottom of the trench so that we could stand on them to keep dry. And on some occasion, dead bodies was put on the top of the trench to make it higher, so that we could walk a bit better instead of crouching.
And contributing to the stalemate were new weapons. By now, the machine gun had been perfected to the point that a single soldier could command as much firepower as 40 riflemen. The tank made its first appearance, invented by the British to get through the dense thickets of barbed wire that protected the enemy trenches. And in April 1915, the Germans introduced the most terrifying weapon of all, poison gas.
No one had ever seen it before. This is the moment when chemical warfare was invented. It scared the living daylights out of the Canadian troops that were hit by it.
The First World War had become a contest not of fighting spirit, but of technological might. And for the soldiers caught in the middle of it, there was no way forward and no way back. There was simply endurance.
You saw a little bush, and you swore that bush was somebody creeping up on you. The perfect soldier then in that war would have been somebody with no imagination whatsoever. We all had too much imagination.
So many men who had been through these dangers and anxieties, their nerve broke and they were the victims of shell shock, you know. There is a breaking point for most people, for everybody really. Robbed of all humanity and courage and everything else that makes life worth living, really. He's descended to something less than human.
The stalemate in the trenches continued through 1915 and into 1916, when the generals decided to go back to their original weapon, their men.
Okay, so there we have a little video clip there. You do have a question?
Yeah, Mr. Newcomb, I actually have an appointment that I have to go to now.
Okay.
It's a doctor, so will I get marked absent?
Well, perhaps not for my class, but you want to make sure that your parents call you in.
Okay. So I'm not going to get marked absent from your class?
No. But again, that's something that you want to take care of also with the attendance if you're going to be gone for other class periods.
Oh, okay. Thank you so much.
Yep. All right. Okay. So with this video clip here, again, for me, I look at it, there's a lot of historical nuggets that relate to total war and to the First World War. Does anyone have like anything that kind of like a takeaway or something, the aha moment, or just a comment about, this little 10-minute clip that we saw about?
It seems like it could be kind of frustrating as a soldier spending all that time in like the trenches and not really making any progress and just having the war of attrition versus like having any active results.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And you do see there after this war, there's actually going to be quite a bit of literature that's going to come out. Here in the United States, a good example would be like Ernest Hemingway with Farewell to Arms, expressing that frustration in the difficulties of being a soldier and from how soldiers are being used, as well as to get a German perspective in there as well. Erich Remarque, trying to say it in German as best I can, All Quiet on the Western Front. And then he'll follow it up with Drei Kamerad, or the Comrades. And it is speaking to that frustration, how going in gung-ho, ready for the fight, and then kind of dragged on. All right, very good observation there. All right, anyone else have an observation or something, a comment?
One thing I saw was how poor the conditions were in the trenches. They said they compared themselves to like animals and not even soldiers. And the trench foot was so bad that they would stand on dead bodies of their peers.
Yep. Again, yeah, the conditions, sometimes, the soldiers were all pumped and ready. They wanted to get into the fight, in how perhaps, it was being projected as, going into battle is a glorious thing, and the imagery and all that stuff. But the reality is, as you can see from the newsreels and the clips from the front. It's far from it. And that's one thing, when we look at media, mass media, and how the First World War becomes documented through imagery. And we could see that in some of the previous conflicts, like our own U.S. Civil War, but then in others. But the conditions, definitely the conditions were not the greatest. And they had to endure. I think that one historian saying, they have to endure. This is what they got. And they're hoping that going over the top, that one last time, that the time going over the top, it's going to be like the last time to go over the top. They talked about a stalemate in there, and the war quickly grinds to a stalemate. In what's contributing to the stalemate is the industrialization of this war and the type of technology. They're being one is trying to think that it's being able to one up the other side, but the other side's able to counter that. And then just how the troops are being used, all that's contributing to the stalemate. So one thing we can think about is technology contributing to an outcome of this war? Is it helping the war come to a conclusion, or are there other factors that are going to bring this war to an end in 1918? So those are some things I want you to consider as we're going through this as well. Is what's really going to bring about end to this conflict? All right. Anyone else have any comments? Some good ones. All right. I got a little ahead of myself here. So one thing that you're looking at when you're putting together your total war activity is taking a look at how people are being used here. And so the role of civilians, whether it's enlisting and fighting or working on the home front. And part of that also is how minorities are being brought in. Well, those who have had me in the past before know that if I can make some Minnesota connections, I'm going to try to do that as best as I can. And then also bring in some personal connections as well. Yesterday was my mom's side of the family, had some doughboys in there. Now there is a group known as the Home Guard and the Minnesota Home Guard. And you'll find the Home Guard actually throughout the United States, not just in Minnesota, but throughout the United States. And so when the Minnesota National Guard was federalized in the spring of 1917, the state was left without a military organization. All right. And so sometimes we think about our National Guard being brought into conflict in contemporary times, but our National Guards have always been used in our conflicts. And so we can go back to the First World War, and our Guard units are being activated. To defend the home front, the Minnesota Commission of Public Safety, which is a government agency, and every state is going to have a commission of public safety, and it's can be accused of far-reaching decisions and maybe heavy-handedness at times to make sure that people are doing what they can for the war effort. But so they have this commission, and they created the Minnesota Home Guard. Now, the Home Guard existed for the duration of World War I, and it performed civilian and military duties. So if there is unrest, the Home Guard is going to be used if there's not a National Guard unit. And in Minnesota, we will have a group known as the 16th Battalion. And this was the first Minnesota recruited African American military unit in state history. And so during World War I, African Americans wanted to serve in the U.S. Armed Forces, but racism meant that they could serve in segregated units. So if we go back to the U.S. Civil War, in which you had the creation of the African American regiments, like the Massachusetts 54th, we knew that they're going to be segregated, perhaps given different roles and tasks. But it's an example of reflective of society at this time. So, William Du Bois of the NAACP did encourage African Americans to enlist and to get involved. Goal is to try to break down the walls of Jim Crow. African American leaders asked the Minnesota governor, Burnquist at the time, to create the unit. And information about enlisting had been promoted in local African American newspapers such as The Appeal. So in Minnesota, we are going to have African American newspapers, mainly because the mainstream newspapers were not necessarily focusing on issues that speak to the African American community. So The Appeal, I think at first it was called the Western Appeal and changed to The Appeal. And so this group was embraced by the African American community in the Twin Cities. They hosted patriotic rallies and parades, and the band actually became very, very popular, and they would put on concerts throughout the Twin Cities. The 16th escort African American soldiers to the train station, so those that have been volunteered or were drafted. Usually had perhaps a little training at Fort Snelling, and the battalion also provided a line of communication between the state government and African American community. So if we want to look at groups, organizations that in many ways help promote and also act as conduits between government and the community, here is an example of that. And so on or around April 1919, it became actually part of the 1st Infantry Battalion of the Minnesota Militia, which is the Minnesota National Guard. So it was brought into the National Guard once the war got over. However, it was still segregated. We're not going to start seeing a desegregated troops realistically in regards to African Americans until really late 40s into the 50s. The Korean War will be our first war in which we'll have integrated armed forces. So there we go. Anyone have any follow-up or any thoughts to that bit? Anything you want to add? All right. So here we go. We have our total war activity that you should be focusing on. Remember, you determine what your finished product is going to be, and it depends on how hard you really want to work with it and where you're at. Know that if you're going for the A, there's a little bit more effort that needs to kick in there. Here are the concepts that you should be focusing on. You got 3 big ones with some sub-elements to it as well. You can work with a historical buddy. So it can be you and 2 others. That's how we get 3. Or you can go solo on it. And so if you are going for the A and you're going solo, just a little bit more work could be put on your shoulders. Okay. And right now I'm going to say tentatively it's due tomorrow, but we'll see. Okay. Is there any questions regarding this?
Is it due by the morning of tomorrow or by like 11:59 tomorrow?
11:59 at night. That's all I'll say. That's all I'll say.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. Okay, so remember ultimately here, that big historical question, no matter what format you're taking or what level you're dealing with, you do want to take on that that last question or that summative question: in what ways can World War I be considered a total war? And using this criteria up here, IB's definition of a total war should play a part into it. And, if it's not hitting all of it, it still can be considered a total war. Here again, it's in what ways. So it is a little gray. It's almost like a to what extent question, but there is a little grayness to it. I mean, you can make a good claim that this war is not necessarily a world war because most of it is fought in Europe. But the participants and the countries that are brought into it speak to it as being a world war. Great Britain is going to rely on its vast empire to provide resources and manpower for this conflict here. And it is going to bring in the United States and Japan is going to be brought in. So it does have that world war flavor to it. All right. Anyone else have any thoughts or questions? All right. Well, it's Wednesday and we're getting closer to that weekend. So if that's what your goal and your hope for, we're almost there, I guess. I will keep this Google Meet open for those who may have questions. If you're working with someone, if you want to be put in breakout rooms, I'll put you in breakout rooms to work with individuals. Stay on as well, ask questions about this or anything, or just stay on to work, okay? If you don't have any questions or concerns, you can have a great day.